Hi, I'm Maribel. The day my husband told me he didn't need me anymore was the same day my father handed him the company I helped build. He didn't even blink when he signed the divorce papers. He just looked me dead in the eye and called me dead weight in front of the entire board. But what he didn't know was that I had the one signature that could end him. And weeks later, he was the one on his knees, whispering my name like a prayer. So tell me, have you ever been betrayed so quietly it took you years to hear the echo? Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from right now? And have you ever been pushed aside by the very people you protected? I was standing in my father's office when it happened. The room smelled faintly of old leather and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Late morning light pushed through the tall windows, landing on the polished table where the senior managers were already seated. I stood off to the side, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked. That position had become familiar to me over the years. My father cleared his throat and smiled the way he always did when he believed he was doing the right thing. I'm proud to announce that effective immediately, Mark will be stepping into the role of Vice President of Operations. There was applause, firm handshakes, a few approving nods. Mark stood up, straightened his jacket, and accepted the congratulations like he had been born for that moment. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look at me at all. I felt a quiet sense of pride rise in my chest before it even registered as dangerous. I had helped build the systems he was about to oversee. I had stayed late nights, smoothed over conflicts, fixed mistakes before they became disasters. I didn't need public credit. I never had. Still, something tightened when no one mentioned my name, not even once. The applause faded. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone joked about long hours ahead. I caught my reflection in the glass cabinet behind them. Calm face, neutral posture. The youngest daughter who never made waves. That was when Mark touched my elbow. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked, already moving toward the hallway. His voice was polite, professional. The same tone he used with vendors. We stepped into an empty conference room down the hall. The door clicked shut behind us, soft but final. The hum of the building wrapped around us, distant phones, muted footsteps, the world continuing as usual. He didn't sit down, neither did I. "This is probably the best time," he said, folding his hands. "Everything's changing anyway." I waited. My heart hadn't caught up yet. He looked at me the way you look at a spreadsheet when the numbers no longer add up. "I've filed for divorce," he said. "I don't think there's any reason to drag it out." The words hung there, neat and clean, like a memo. I noticed the way my fingers curled into my palm, how the air felt thinner, how my body reacted before my mind could follow. "I don't need you anymore," he added, almost kindly. "This just makes sense." I didn't ask about counseling. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask if there was someone else, even though the thought flashed through me like a warning light. I stood very still and let the moment pass through me without breaking. Years of being the youngest had taught me something valuable. Silence could keep the peace. Silence could keep you safe. At least, that's what I had always believed. He talked for another minute. Logistics, paperwork, timing. His words blurred together, business language dressed up as mercy. I nodded where it seemed appropriate. My body knew how to perform even when my mind drifted somewhere else. When he finally left the room, I stayed behind. I placed my hands on the table and waited until the faint shaking stopped. I didn't cry. Not then. I told myself that this was what maturity looked like. Control, dignity. Not falling apart in a hallway where someone might see. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk signing a routine approval form, the kind I had signed hundreds of times before. I reached into my bag and took out my fountain pen, the one I'd been using for years. One of the assistants glanced at it and smiled. "You still use that thing?" she asked. "Surprised it hasn't run dry." I smiled back and capped the pen without answering. By the time I left the building, the sky had shifted. The light was lower, sharper. I walked to my car slowly, aware of how quiet everything felt inside me, not empty, just held together by habit. As I drove home, it finally settled in. That promotion wasn't just about Mark moving up. It was about me fading out. About decisions being made where I was no longer part of the equation. Something wasn't ending. Something was being taken. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, I would hear my name used in a way that changed everything. I carried that uneasy feeling with me down the hallway, the kind that settles in your shoulders before your mind can explain why. After leaving my father's office, I stopped by my desk, straightened a few files I didn't need to touch, and glanced at my calendar as if it could offer some warning. The board meeting was scheduled for early afternoon. Routine. That was the word I kept telling myself. I walked toward the boardroom a few minutes before the meeting started. The glass walls reflected my movement back at me. Steady steps, composed posture. I looked like someone who belonged there. I had belonged there for years. Inside, the room felt different right away. The long table was the same, the chairs arranged neatly, water glasses already set. But my place had shifted. I wasn't seated near the center anymore. My name card sat closer to the end, near the wall. A small change, almost polite. Easy to miss if you didn't know the map of that room by heart. I took my seat without comment. I told myself it was temporary, nothing to read into. Still, I noticed who was closer to the decision-makers now. I noticed who wasn't. The door closed, conversations faded. My father took his place at the head of the table. He looked calm, composed, all business. When he began speaking, his voice was measured, the same tone he used with clients and investors. "We need to talk about direction," he said. "About efficiency. About positioning the company for what's ahead." Not once did his eyes find mine. The words were familiar. I had helped draft versions of them in the past. Restructuring, optimization, necessary adjustments. There was no mention of family, no shared history. The language had been stripped clean of anything personal. As he spoke, I felt a strange distance settle in, as if I were listening from behind glass. This wasn't a discussion. It was an announcement dressed as conversation. Then Mark leaned forward. He spoke confidently, like someone certain the room was already on his side. He started by outlining workflow issues, redundancies, places where the company was carrying more than it needed. His voice was steady, practiced. "There are roles," he said, "that once made sense but no longer serve the company's goals." He paused, just long enough. "And there are people," he continued, "who have become dead weight that needed to be removed." He said my name right after. The room went quiet. Not the awkward kind, the kind that accepts what's been said. I didn't look at my father. I couldn't. I stared at the grain of the table, at a small scratch near the edge, and focused on my breathing. In that moment, sound seemed to drain away. I was aware of my hands resting flat, of my feet planted firmly on the floor. My body stayed present, even as something inside me pulled back. I didn't defend myself. I didn't interrupt. I knew if I spoke, my voice would carry more than words. It would carry years, and I wasn't ready to let that spill out where it could be used against me. Silence wasn't weakness then. It was containment. As the meeting moved on, I realized this hadn't been spontaneous. The phrasing was too clean, the timing too precise. This wasn't frustration, it was preparation. They had decided who I was going to be before I walked into the room. Not a partner, not family, a liability. I lifted my eyes and looked around the table. Faces I had worked beside for decades avoided my gaze. A few looked uncomfortable, none spoke up. I memorized them anyway. Every expression, every pause. Something inside me shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I felt it settle into place. When the meeting adjourned, chairs moved back and papers were gathered. Normal motions resumed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I stayed seated until the room began to empty. I didn't cry. I didn't explain myself. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out with my head level. That was the moment I understood they weren't waiting for me to leave. They were waiting for me to disappear. I walked out of the building without anyone trying to stop me. No one called my name. No assistant hurried after me with an apology or a question. The hallway felt longer than it had that morning, and my footsteps echoed louder now that I was alone. By the time I reached the elevator, the weight of the silence had settled fully on my shoulders. The parking garage was already filling with evening sounds. Engines turning over, a car alarm chirping once and then stopping. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed, the sound bouncing off concrete walls. It all felt strangely amplified, as if the world had turned the volume up just to remind me that it hadn't paused for my humiliation. I unlocked my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, almost calm. No text buzzed on my phone, no message from my father asking if I was all right. No note from Mark saying maybe they should talk later. That was when it became clear. The silence wasn't accidental anymore. It was complete. Driving home, traffic slowed me down in a way that felt cruelly appropriate. Red lights stretched the distance between one thought and the next. I watched other drivers tapping their brakes, adjusting the radio, living their ordinary lives. I wondered how many of them had just been erased in a room full of people who once depended on them. People have always expected me to stay quiet. It's never been said outright, but it's understood. I was the youngest, the one who smoothed things over, the one who didn't push back when voices got sharp or decisions were made without me. Growing up, I learned quickly what earned praise: being agreeable, being flexible, letting things go. When disagreements happened at the dinner table, I was the one who changed the subject. When plans shifted, I adapted. Adults called it maturity. I believed them. There were moments, small but clear, when I realized my job wasn't to be heard. It was to keep things comfortable for everyone else. I did it well, too well. That understanding followed me all the way back to my childhood home, the place I stopped by out of habit rather than intention. The house looked the same from the outside: trim hedges, lights on in the front room, familiar and distant at the same time. Standing in the doorway, I remembered a dinner from years ago. I must have been in my early 20s. I had been excited about an idea, something I'd been working on quietly. I shared it halfway through the meal, my voice careful, measured. The response was polite silence. Forks kept moving. Someone asked for the salt. The conversation drifted elsewhere as if I hadn't spoken at all. I sat there then, just like I had in that boardroom earlier, listening to the room breathe around me, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. That memory rose now, uninvited but precise. Different table, same quiet dismissal. For a long time, I thought moments like that were my fault, that I needed to explain better, be more patient, choose a better time. But sitting there in my car, engine idling, I asked myself a question I had never allowed before. What if I wasn't wrong? What if I was simply convenient? I began to see the difference between responsibility and guilt. I had carried both for years, assuming they were the same. They weren't. One belonged to me. The other had been handed to me because I was willing to hold it. Earlier that day, someone had said a sentence that stuck with me more than the rest. It was said casually, almost dismissively. That doesn't matter anymore. At the time, I'd nodded, accepted it. Now the words echoed differently. It wasn't just about a process or a role, it was about me. That realization hurt in a quiet, precise way. Not explosive, just sharp enough to linger. Silence had once protected me. It kept me from becoming the problem. It kept relationships intact, at least on the surface. But now I could feel the cost of it, pressing in from all sides. I still didn't know what I was going to do next. I wasn't plotting revenge or drafting speeches in my head. I wasn't ready for that. But something inside me had shifted just enough to hold its ground. I still didn't plan to fight back, but for the first time, I stopped planning to vanish. I returned to the office on Monday as if nothing had happened. I parked in the same spot, took the elevator up to the 8th floor, walked down the hallway past the framed company milestones, some of which I had helped create, and greeted the receptionist with a nod and a faint smile. She smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The building smelled the same, like coffee and carpet cleaner, and everything was where it should have been. Yet, everything felt different. People greeted me, but only in passing. Not a single conversation lingered. No one asked about my weekend. No one pulled me aside to say they'd heard what happened, or offered that awkward, half-hearted, "Are you okay?" that usually follows messy boardroom moments. Instead, they looked at me like someone who no longer had a seat at the table but hadn't gotten the memo yet. In the hallway outside my office, I paused. My name was still on the door. My chair was still there. But when I stepped inside, the air felt cooler, thinner. I sat down slowly, not quite sure if I belonged anymore. Something unspoken had settled into the space, an absence that hadn't yet been defined out loud. I powered up my computer and opened my inbox. It was oddly quiet, fewer emails than I usually had by mid-morning. I checked the filters. Nothing looked off. I checked my folders, then the calendar. I wasn't on the schedule for the usual Monday strategic meeting. My name was missing from the team alignment session I'd led for the past 4 years. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, a glitch. But then I remembered the way the receptionist's smile had felt. Rehearsed. I clicked through again. Still nothing. I went looking for old project folders, files I'd built, refined, delivered. The folders were still there, but they'd been reassigned. My name was no longer listed as the owner. A younger analyst's name had replaced mine in the metadata. No one told me. They just adjusted. It was like watching your own reflection fade out of a photograph. That afternoon, I heard voices through the glass wall of a nearby conference room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but a phrase pulled me in. "We shifted direction after the last leadership change," someone said, a man's voice I didn't immediately recognize. "We restructured the outreach strategy, moved away from the redundant models from before." Redundant. That word stuck. He was talking about a campaign I designed, one that brought in our largest community contract. I had written every piece of it, pitched it personally, and trained the team to implement it. And now it was being referred to like a forgotten draft someone had stumbled upon in a drawer. Another voice chimed in. "We're seeing much leaner results now that we've removed unnecessary layers." Unnecessary, redundant, shifted. My name was never mentioned, but it was all about me. That's when I understood this wasn't carelessness. It was storytelling. They weren't just moving forward, they were rewriting what had happened, reframing the past to justify the present. And in this new version of the story, I was nothing but a footnote. Later that day, in the break room, a senior colleague, Margaret, someone I'd once considered an ally, walked past me slowly, then circled back. "You know," she said, lowering her voice, "sometimes it's better not to push when things are already moving. Just let the dust settle." Her tone was soft. Her words sounded like advice, but the message was clear. Don't stir the waters. Don't ask questions. Don't make this harder than it already is. I nodded. I smiled, but inside a line had been drawn. Because silence wasn't just expected now, it was demanded. I returned to my desk and stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the black glass. I had spent my career making other people look composed, collected, in control. I knew exactly how the machine worked. And now that same machine was turning its gears in my direction. But something shifted inside me. For the first time, I saw this not as a personal failure, but as a coordinated operation. A system built to erase without fingerprints. This wasn't about performance. It wasn't even about business. It was about control. I wasn't going to raise my voice or pound on the table. That wasn't me. But I wasn't going to apologize for existing either. So I sat still. I didn't correct them. I didn't speak up when credit was misassigned. I didn't fight for meeting invites or demand inclusion. Instead, I watched, listened, collected. I started noticing who sent which emails, who used which words, who avoided eye contact, who corrected the record, and who let the lies grow roots. And with every silent observation, something in me stiffened, not out of fear, but out of clarity. They thought they were easing me out, but what they were really doing was teaching me how they moved. It became a kind of muscle strain, holding my face in neutral every time I walked down the hallway. Every polite smile I returned felt like lifting weights I didn't ask to carry. Small talk with people who used to linger now lasted 10 seconds flat. Even the way the receptionist greeted me had changed. Her eyes no longer met mine. They all knew something I didn't. Or worse, they knew exactly what I did and had already decided not to care. Every morning I showed up, sat at my desk, logged in, and watched the air around me shift like weather. I wasn't just excluded from projects, I was slowly being made irrelevant. It was efficient, painless if you didn't count the internal bruising. No one raised their voice, no one slammed a door. They simply unhooked me from the current, one cord at a time, until I was left sitting in silence with a machine that rarely blinked. Silence used to come naturally, but now it took work. Real work. Every second I didn't speak up, every time I bit my tongue when I heard my name erased from credit, it cost me. There were days I'd walk into the bathroom just to press a cold paper towel to my face, to convince myself I still existed. I wasn't invisible. I was being made invisible. It's a very different thing. Late Wednesday, I got called into a private meeting. It was my husband's voice that left the message, but he didn't sign it like he used to. No M, no nickname. Just, "Maribel, we need to speak today. Please come by my office before you leave." That was all. His door was already cracked when I arrived. He didn't look up right away. He made me wait. That was new. When he finally did, his tone was gentle, professional. I'd heard him use it with difficult clients before. "I just want to say this directly, to avoid misunderstanding," he said, lacing his fingers together on the desk. "There's been some talk about your role, your future here. I think it might be best, for everyone, if you considered stepping away quietly." He smiled, and I hated how practiced it looked. "For your reputation," he added, like it was some kind of olive branch. "There's a graceful way to exit this, and I wanted to make sure you had that option." I stared at him. That face I once knew so well. It looked like a suit now, just skin over strategy. "This wasn't personal," he said, which only confirmed that it was. I didn't answer. I just sat there, watching the way his mouth moved, as if we were talking about a corporate restructure and not my life. "Think about it," he finished. "No pressure, but timing is important." And then he looked down at his phone like I was already gone. That night, I sat on my couch, the lights low, my shoes still on. I didn't have the strength to change clothes. I didn't even open the fridge, I just sat. The living room was too quiet. Even the house seemed to be tiptoeing around me, unsure how to treat someone who might not be staying much longer. They said I could leave with my dignity. They didn't realize they'd already taken it. I remembered something my father used to say when I was young. Real leaders know when to sacrifice for the greater good. Back then, it sounded noble, responsible. But now I heard it for what it was: conditioning. You teach someone long enough that pain is noble, and they'll never question why they're the only one bleeding. I'd been sacrificing since I was 23, giving credit, stepping back, agreeing to less, always for the good of the company, the family, the image. Every time I said yes when I meant no, it was recorded in invisible ink, stored in some unwritten ledger they only pulled out when it benefited them. No one ever saw it as generosity, just predictability. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hand trembled a little, not from fear, but from the weight of everything unsaid. For the first time, I imagined what it would feel like to walk away completely, to not wait for them to push me out, but to simply disappear before they got the satisfaction. I could sell the house, move somewhere quieter, maybe coastal, maybe inland. I could live smaller, simpler, no more meetings, no more masks, just me. That sounded peaceful, maybe even merciful. I sat with that thought for a long time. But peace wasn't the same as healing, and walking away didn't undo the story they were already telling about me. Later that night, I pulled an old notebook from a drawer, one I used to write in before things got complicated. On the inside cover, I had scribbled a quote I once heard but never fully understood until now. Silence is sometimes a sanctuary. Other times, it's a sentence. I had confused one for the other. I flipped through the pages, notes from years ago, thoughts, ideas, pieces of plans. And in the margin of one page, a phrase I hadn't remembered writing. If you keep choosing peace to be included, don't be surprised when you disappear without protest. It hit me hard because it wasn't a warning from someone else. It was from me, from a version of myself that hadn't been crushed yet. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I just closed the book and sat in the stillness, finally understanding how far I had drifted from myself. This was my floor, my emotional basement. There was nothing left to give them, not without losing something I wouldn't get back. And I didn't know what I was going to do, only that staying silent had finally cost me more than speaking ever could. I woke before the alarm. No dreams, just stillness. The kind that comes not from rest, but from emotional fatigue that has burned itself into a kind of numb readiness. I lay there, eyes on the ceiling, feeling my chest rise and fall, realizing the fear hadn't left. It was still there, curled up in a corner of my chest, like a cat that refused to move. But it wasn't driving the car anymore. I got up, brewed coffee, and opened the blinds to the backyard. Morning hadn't fully arrived. The sky was still more navy than blue. It reminded me of those early days when I was just starting out. Young, determined, convinced that doing the right thing would always mean something. That effort would be recognized. That family would protect. Now I understood better. I didn't want revenge. Not really. I didn't want to yell or storm into offices or send dramatic emails. What I wanted was proof. Proof that I had not imagined the erasure. Proof that I had a right to be in every room they had quietly removed me from. So I started with the files. The ones they thought I forgot. The ones buried in the shared drive of my home computer, from a time when my name still meant something in the company structure. Legal documents, transfer agreements, board minutes. My mother's estate file, which had once passed across my hands during a late-night review, back when we all still acted like we were building something together. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I trusted the process of looking. 3 hours passed, marked only by coffee refills and the hum of the heater kicking in. My eyes scanned, scrolled, paused, reread. And then I saw it. A clause. One I'd seen before and ignored. Standard language in a shareholder transition agreement. But this time I read it differently. Maybe because I no longer believed anything was standard. Voting rights may not be reassigned without written consent of the original beneficiary. That original beneficiary was my mother, and she hadn't reassigned anything before she died. I stared at it, heart thudding. Slowly, I pulled open the hard copy version from my file cabinet, tucked inside a manila folder with her handwriting still visible on the edge. The paper was worn but intact, the same clause, clear, clean, final. For a few minutes, I couldn't move, not from shock. This wasn't shocking, it was validating. They had counted on me forgetting. They had counted on no one reading the fine print. I pushed the chair back, stood up, and walked into the next room. Opened the drawer of the old desk I had kept untouched for years. Inside it, wrapped in a cloth, was her pen. A fountain pen, deep green, gold tip. She always said it helped her think clearer. She used to say, "Don't sign anything unless you've read it twice, and if it feels off, read it a third time out loud." I uncapped the pen and held it between my fingers. It had weight, not just physically, but emotionally. It was hers. But more than that, it was part of the reason I still had a voice, a legal voice, one they had either missed or chosen to ignore. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. That afternoon, I returned to the office. I didn't dress differently. Didn't wear red or heels or lipstick meant to signal a statement. I wore what I always wore, simple gray, a cardigan, flats. Let them stay comfortable in their misjudgment. Instead of heading to my desk, I made a quiet stop at records. The room was tucked into a corner most executives forgot existed, the kind of place only used when legal needed something printed or when HR had to pull paperwork after someone resigned. I knew the layout by heart. I'd helped redesign it 3 years ago. They'd forgotten that part. I found the logbook, signed in, and located the document I needed, the one that confirmed what I'd seen the night before. No amendments, no overrides. The power still sat with the original beneficiary, or in this case, her direct heir. Me. I didn't photocopy it. I didn't email it to myself. I simply read it. I let the words settle in my chest like stones clicking into place. Then I opened my notebook, the one I'd begun carrying again, and wrote down a date. The date I would file. Not now, not yet. Timing wasn't about impulse. It was about control. Later, back at my desk, I watched them move. The same rehearsed smiles. The same brief greetings. But I wasn't absorbing it the way I used to. I was watching them like someone who finally had the missing script. Before leaving that day, a colleague stopped me in the hallway. Someone who used to respect me, but now treated me like a fragile piece of history. "Maribel," she said, in that careful tone people use when they think they're delivering mercy. "I just hope you're at peace with whatever decision you make." I nodded once. "I am," I said, though I knew she didn't understand what that meant. At home that evening, I didn't sit in the dark. I cooked. I listened to jazz. I opened the windows even though the air was chilly. And when I passed the mirror, I looked directly into it, not to study the wear in my face or the fatigue in my eyes, but to meet the person who had stopped disappearing. I knew this path would cost me something, possibly a lot. Relationships, comfort, illusions of unity. But what I would gain was worth more. Myself. They still thought I was cornered, and that mistake was about to cost them everything. The shift was subtle at first, eye contact avoided more often. Meetings that once included me now ran out of room at the table. It wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't say. How quickly conversations died when I walked in. How the warmth in people's voices chilled the moment they realized I was in earshot. 1 week after I quietly reclaimed my footing, the air inside corporate felt thick, like it knew something was coming. It was a Tuesday when the retaliation landed. I'd just finished reviewing old contracts in my office when a ping alerted me to a new message, not a personal one. It was a general company-wide memo. I opened it like I would any other. But before I finished reading the second paragraph, my chest tightened. The language was neutral, legal slick, but it didn't need to shout to wound. It spoke in implications, the kind that are designed to stay just inside the bounds of deniability. In light of recent leadership concerns, we remain committed to emotional stability and operational clarity at the highest levels of this firm. Emotional stability. They weren't firing me. They were framing me. The next hour unfolded like slow-motion demolition. I received 5 forwarded emails from various colleagues, none with commentary, just subject lines like, "You should see this," or thoughts. All of them referenced the same vague concern: my capacity to lead, my increasingly erratic behavior since the divorce, my emotional volatility. One even implied I had fabricated documentation regarding my mother's estate. That was when I felt the first wave of nausea hit. Not because it was true, but because I knew what came next. They weren't just trying to remove me. They were trying to discredit me first, disgrace me, so that when I left, and they expected I would, no one would question why. I closed my laptop, locked my office, and walked to the elevator. I didn't cry, not then. But I did feel my throat tighten, not from grief, but from pressure. A pressure I hadn't let touch me in years. I needed air, space, something not scripted by boardroom politics. So I drove, not home, not to a friend's. I ended up at a park near the edge of town. It was nearly dusk. I sat on a cold bench, watching wind shake the brittle branches of late fall trees. I heard his voice again, my husband's, from months ago. "You're just not useful in this version of the company, Maribel. Don't take it personal." He'd meant it as strategy. I'd taken it as cruelty. Now I saw it for what it was: alignment. The same thinking lived inside the walls of that boardroom, and I wasn't just inconvenient now. I was labeled unstable. And once a woman's been labeled unstable, truth stops mattering. I almost gave in. Sitting there in the cold, I imagined what it would look like to just step away, quietly, no announcement, no defense, just vanish. Let them have it all: the company, the legacy, the narrative. Would it really be such a loss? But something stopped me. Not anger, not pride, just something deeper. A feeling I hadn't recognized in a long time: worth. They didn't deserve to rewrite me. Back home, I turned on the lamp in my home office and opened the locked drawer of my filing cabinet. I didn't need anyone's approval. I needed records, and I had them. Archived board decisions, voting tallies, handwritten annotations on scanned meeting minutes, approval trails that told a different story than the one now being passed around. They'd moved too fast. In their rush to sideline me, they'd left procedural fingerprints everywhere, like the vote to reassign key financial authority, the one that, per charter, required unanimous consent. Except I had never signed, or the amendment they filed regarding shareholder distributions, filed with my digital signature weeks after I had changed passwords and revoked access. Careless, arrogant, but now provable. The emails they used to circulate the memo, all traceable, all internally archived, and I still had legacy admin access they'd forgotten to revoke. That night, I printed every document, created a timeline, highlighted discrepancies. It didn't feel vindictive, it felt clean. I wasn't trying to win a war, I was trying to remove the poison from the bloodstream. The next morning, I sat quietly through a staff meeting. No one looked at me directly, but I noticed how some avoided even glancing in my direction, as if association might stain them. Let them look away, let them squirm. I was done shrinking. I didn't speak up in the meeting. I didn't send a rebuttal email, not yet. Instead, I picked up my phone and scheduled a meeting with outside counsel. One I trusted, quiet, discreet. It wasn't about dragging anyone through the mud. It was about naming what had been done and documenting what came next, because they wanted a public reckoning. And I was finally ready to give them one, on my terms. 2 days later, I stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor of the downtown headquarters. My heels clicked on the polished floor, but the sound barely registered. My mind was too clear, too focused. There was no shaking in my hands this time, no second-guessing in my gut. The storm was here, and I was walking straight into its eye. They had called this a formal restructuring session. A pleasant phrase for an execution, but I knew better. This wasn't about restructuring. This was about power, and who they believed had lost it. When I opened the door to the boardroom, the air was tight with anticipation. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. I caught the flicker of a few sideways glances before faces turned blank, polite. At the head of the table sat Alan, my ex-husband, my once business partner, and the man who now believed he held all the cards. He smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly either. Just with the smug confidence of someone convinced the game was already over. "Maribel," he said, gesturing to an empty seat at the far end. "Thanks for coming." I sat down without acknowledging the chair's placement, without reacting to the way they'd seated me apart, subtly but deliberately. Distance always sends a message. They wanted it to look like I didn't belong here anymore. They were sure I'd gotten the message already. I folded my hands neatly in front of me. Let him talk. Alan stood, palms resting lightly on the table. As most of you are aware, there have been concerns about consistency in leadership. Emotional strain, operational misalignment. Nothing we can't handle with grace and professionalism. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the knife twist slow. "I've worked with Maribel a long time," he continued. "I know the pressure she's been under, the divorce, her mother's passing. They've taken a toll." He turned his eyes to me just briefly. "She's become, frankly, unpredictable. And while we all value her legacy, we must also protect the company. We can't afford emotional liability at this level of decision-making." Emotional liability. It landed like a slap. Some in the room looked away. Others nodded, barely perceptible, almost relieved someone had said it aloud. For a second, I said nothing. Let them sit in it. Let the performance run its course. And then I stood, slowly, without rush, without defense. "I'd like to clarify a few things," I said. No one stopped me, but no one invited me either. That was fine. I wasn't there for permission. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Thick, labeled, stamped. Not emotion, evidence. "I believe some of you have been shown a version of events," I began. "One shaped carefully over months, possibly longer. What you haven't seen, until now, are the documents that tell the other side." Alan shifted in his seat, a small twitch in his jaw. I laid the papers out one by one. "Here is the original. Authorization for the estate transition," I said, voice even. "Fully executed by both board and legal. And here," I slid the second document forward, "is the policy requiring unanimous consent before any financial redistribution." I looked around the room, pausing on faces, not rushing. This document was never signed by me. And yet, decisions were enacted under my name. I watched realization ripple like wind across wheat. And here, I pulled the final file from the folder, is the login activity showing access from Alan's device to restricted archives, 2 weeks after his access was revoked. A low breath left someone's throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. Alan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of fact was doing the work. I turned back to the group. For the past year, I've been called everything from outdated to erratic. Some of you were led to believe I was dead weight. I let that phrase hang in the air, the very one Alan had once thrown at me behind closed doors. I watched his eyes flick toward me. He knew I remembered. He just hadn't thought I'd say it out loud. And maybe I was, I said, still calm. But let's define who carried what. I stepped back from the table slightly, giving them room to absorb. I kept this company solvent during the merger. I personally renegotiated vendor contracts that saved us millions. I led the expansion strategy that opened 2 new markets, both now fully profitable. My tone stayed measured, but I could see it. The shift. The power didn't just swing back, it snapped. Alan stood, voice tense now. This is emotional. You're spinning this for sympathy. I turned to him directly, unblinking. Then let's go back to the numbers, the ones I submitted to the compliance committee 2 hours ago. He froze. He hadn't expected that. The room shifted again. Now they weren't looking at me with doubt. They were looking at him with questions, real ones. Why wasn't the board informed? One member asked sharply. Who else accessed restricted files? Another followed. Alan tried to respond. He stumbled. And suddenly, the man who had been so confident 10 minutes ago looked pale, like a door had closed behind him and he hadn't noticed until it was locked. I stayed quiet, not smug, not vengeful, just still, because I didn't need to win an argument. I only needed the truth to speak, and it had. I won't waste your time or mine, I said, gathering the papers. What happens next is up to you. But let the record show I was never gone. I was just watching. I paused at the door, turning just once. I never asked for my seat back. I came to reclaim what was already mine. That was the moment he understood. I was never asking for my place back. I was taking it. The boardroom emptied in silence, like a wake no one had the words for. No one offered congratulations. No one patted my back. Chairs scraped, papers gathered, footsteps trailed off. I stayed seated a moment longer, staring at the spot where Alan had stood only minutes before, where everything had cracked open, and not with a bang, just a quiet truth landing exactly where it needed to. There wasn't relief, not really. Just a slow, steady unwinding. The kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. 3 weeks passed in fragments. Reports were filed, statements were taken. Outside counsel came in like a cold wind, clinical and efficient. Alan's removal was swift, not dramatic, but surgical. No handcuffs, no front-page headlines. Just a line in an email from HR and a memo to staff about organizational realignment. His name didn't appear again after that, but the stain lingered. There was a weight to it all, not guilt, not regret, just the undeniable cost for everyone. He lost everything that gave him leverage, his title, his clout, the polished veneer that had protected him for years. But he didn't lose his freedom. And honestly, I wasn't sure which would have cut deeper. There's a kind of punishment in having to live with the truth, especially when you spent years building a life on lies. The day he showed up at my office, I was reviewing quarterly reports. He didn't knock. "Maribel," he said softly. I looked up, but I didn't smile. He looked smaller, Not physically, but in the way people look when they finally see themselves through someone else's eyes. He didn't wear a tie. His voice had none of its usual polish. I didn't know who else to come to, he said. I waited. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you, but they're going after me hard now. It's more than I expected, and I thought maybe I'd stop them, I asked. He nodded, almost ashamed. I leaned back in my chair, not angry, not even surprised. Alan, I'm not interested in revenge, I said, but I'm also not in the business of saving people from the consequences they created. He looked away, biting the inside of his cheek. He used to do that when he was cornered. I remembered it from a lifetime ago, back when I used to want to rescue him. You think I deserve all of it? He whispered. I think you didn't expect anyone would ever say no to you, I said gently. And now someone did. That's not punishment. That's reality. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and walked out without another word. I didn't watch him go. A few days later, I passed a conversation in the hallway. 2 junior associates were whispering near the break room. One of them said it, that old phrase, the one that used to hollow me out. She was just dead weight, he muttered, clearly repeating something he'd overheard. I paused, waited for the familiar sting. It never came. The words didn't land. They didn't sink. They didn't even stay. That's when I realized they didn't matter anymore. Not because they'd become untrue, but because I had stopped believing them. I'd defined myself by their language for so long. By what I was to other people, wife, fixer, placeholder. But that morning, standing there with my coffee cooling in my hand, I realized I didn't need to fight the words. I just needed to stop carrying them. And so I did. Work became quieter, more intentional. I stepped back into my role without fanfare. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to the board, not to the staff, not to Alan. I started mentoring 2 young women in finance, not because it was strategic, but because I wanted to. There was peace in the steady rhythm of ordinary things. Filing old documents, reworking policy drafts, calling vendors by name. I didn't need a podium. I just needed to own the space I occupied, fully, without apology. One evening, I walked the long way home. The streets were lit with the first hints of spring. Warmer light, softer air. I stopped at the courthouse steps out of habit more than anything. The same place where I'd once sat, years ago, waiting on a lawyer's call about the divorce. Back then, I felt like everything was breaking at once. Now, everything was simply different, not perfect, not healed, just honest. And that was enough. Back home, I made tea and sat by the window, legs curled under me, silence humming around the house like an old friend. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I didn't think speaking would matter. I knew better now. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a polite face. I chose differently this time. I chose to speak, to stand, to stay. And in doing that, I hadn't destroyed him. I just stopped disappearing for him.